I continue to read the biography of Walter Lippmann. Chapter 27, A Gate Unlocked. This is the second part. Helen was not a woman to be defeated by geography or inconvenience. Why not meet in Europe in August? She suggested. She could leave Gregor with her friends and join him at some discreet place. He could arrange to come on a short fact-gathering trip without failure. Caught up in the excitement of a clandestine meeting, made bold and a bit reckless by his happiness, he eagerly ascended. Helen consulted her well-thumbed guide blue and discovered the perfect spot, the cathedral town of Bourges in the Cher, about 200 kilometers south of Paris. They would meet there on August 17. Although both had plunged wildly into this affair, they hadn't given any serious thought to dissolving their marriages. Never having known anything like this, Walter was as disturbed as he was excited by their affair. For the first time since he had courted Faye 20 years earlier, he was in love. This was hardly adolescent infatuation. He was 47. Helen was 40. He brought to her the passion of a man whose emotional life had long been frozen. He gave himself to Helen completely, as he had never given him to anyone before. The thought of being separated from her, if only for 2 months, made him fear for the survival of what they had discovered. Quote, "It is very quiet here in my study, where I have worked for so many years," end quote. He wrote Helen on the eve of her departure for Europe. Quote, "But all the unfamiliar things are strange. I know what I have always shrunk from knowing, that though I'm in these places, I'm not of them, and that but for what you and I have found together, all that was left was to learn to be resigned. One can go a long way in solitude, but alas, one can go no further alone. Those things which make us more than animated and quarrelsome vegetables cannot be had by the imagination alone. As for myself, I think you know that I'm like a man who has seen in his mind's eye the glories of this existence, but had wandered through the endless corridors, looking into empty rooms. Still, suddenly you unlock the gate to the real world. Oh, my dear, I could go on forever, saying always the same thing in 1,000 different ways. For you bind me and release me both. You bind me with the sweet grace of your love, and release me with the sweet grace of your love, and release me like an old bird who has flown wild, being long caged, and is once again on the wing." As the weeks passed and her absence weighed more heavily, his letters became more ardent and concerned about the future. From the pine forests of Mount Desert Island in May, where he and Faye had gone to visit their friends, Thomas and Gretchen Finletter, at the end of June, he wrote Helen that they must never again accept arrangements that separated us so cruelly. Quote, "I know that we have only one fear, the fear of hurting others," end quote. He added a few days later, "And I know too that somehow we must and shall at last go openly together, hand in hand," end quote. Helen responded in kind to these wild promises, encouraging his hope that they could build something more permanent. Quote, "When I sailed off on the Normandy," she wrote him from Dubrovnik, addressing her letters to the Century Club in order to circumvent both Faye and his secretary. Quote, "If you had asked me what my idea of my future was, I think I should have answered vaguely that perhaps at the end of 3 or 4 years, when Gregor would be going off to college, perhaps then we might begin that painful, complicated breaking of all those ties which had bound us so long. We had come together so short a time before. We were so happy when we were together. I felt that when you were very happy, you still needed from me warmth and reassurance rather than the bringing up of problems which you would then have feared from me, that I decided not to waste any of our previous precious time thinking of such things." End quote. Now, she was not so sure she could wait 3 or 4 years. She thought it likely that after a while, try as we may, we shall betray our real feelings for one another, and that this may be more painful to those whom we want not to hurt than an open break. For her, there were 2 choices. I must either act a part, which, if one thinks about it, is contemptible as well as difficult, and in the end degrading to both sides. Or I must change our whole relationship. I mean my relationship with Hamilton, of course. Establish it on a cool, impersonal basis, which is so unlike me that I don't think it can be done. End quote. And even if she could handle her relationship with Hamilton, there was their daughter, Gregor, who might turn from me for a time more than I like. End quote. Yet she made it clear that she was willing to take these risks. What she wanted from Walter was some kind of a commitment. He did not realize that was what she meant, nor was he yet willing to offer it. During the weeks of their separation, he tried to lead a normal life. He continued to turn out his column 3 days a week, traveled to Washington for talks with officials, went to the Midwest to deliver a round of speeches, worked out at the gym, and escorted Faye regularly to dinner parties. One would not have guessed from his columns dealing with the court packing plan, then at a critical point, that his mind was filled with thoughts of Helen, as if he did not have enough to deal with. There were other complications. While he was in Bar Harbor visiting the Finletters, denouncing FDR, going over the proofs of the good society, and trying to sort out his emotions, one of his friends decided that she was in love with him, sensing that he seemed more estranged than usual from Faye, and thus perhaps more available. The woman rushed in with a declaration of her passion. This was not a passion he could ever have reciprocated or encouraged. When he reminded her that he was a married man, she laughed disdainfully. And when he told her that, however flattered he was by her attention, he could not return it, she called him a cold fish. Still refusing to take no for an answer, she demanded to know whether he was in love with someone else. The light came quickly to his eyes. "Oh, my dear," he wrote Helen in recounting the episode, "will there be no end to the need for not hurting others?" End quote. End the quote. "But at least my wits did not fail me, and I do not have to have anything very tragic on my conscience. It is agreed that I am quite no human, and that's that. And when I was cornered and asked question point blank, 'Are you in love with someone?' I was able to reply, 'God help me, oh, no, no,' in a most convincing tone. I hated to say that. I would so much have liked to say, 'Yes, completely and everlastingly and uniquely.'" End quote. A new sense of enthusiasm and hope replaced his old stoicism. Quote, "I think a little for myself and know, I think, in a detached way, that there is in me some capacity to see the world, and that I must use it, and use it up before I die." End quote. He wrote Helen from Maine. Quote, "The other night I listened to a hermit thrush singing in the woods, and I too must sing my little song, I suppose. Now I know that I have written a better book." End quote. He said the Good Society. Quote, "which will throw a bit of light ahead for some lonely fellows somewhere, because you put your hand in mine that evening last January. The consciousness of that unfrozen my spirit while I worked in Florida, and enabled me to be impervious to all external things." End quote. The optimism that had entered his life spilled over into his writing. Phrases, paragraphs, sometimes whole columns that harked back to an earlier and more idealistic Lippmann relieved the stale negativism of his anti-New Deal diatribes. When Amelia Earhart set off in July on a round-the-world flight during which she disappeared over New Guinea, he wrote a lyric column that said a good deal more about his own state of mind than about the bravery of the Avicheks. Quote, "The world is a better place to live in because it contains human beings who will give up ease and security and stake their own lives in order to do what they themselves think worth doing, who are brave without cruelty to others and impassioned with the idea that this dignifies all who contemplate it." End quote, he wrote, as though idolizing what he was about to do himself. Quote, "The best things of mankind are as useless as Amelia Earhart's adventure. In such persons, mankind overcomes the inertia which would keep it earthbound forever in its habitual ways. They have in them the free and useless energy with which alone men surpass themselves. Such energy cannot be planned or managed. It is wild and free, but all the heroes, the saints and the seers, the explorers and the creators partake of it. They do not know what they discover. They do not know where their impulse is taking them. They have been possessed for a time with an extraordinary passion, which is unintelligible in ordinary human terms. Then do the useless, brave, noble, the divinely foolish, and the very wisest things that are done by man, and what they prove to themselves and to others is that man is no mere automation in his routine, no mere cog in the collective machine, but that in the dust of which His made there is also fair, lighted now and then by great winds from the sky.